All right, everyone. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Contemporary Debates on Market Institutions. This lecture today on externalities is quite uh, appropriate because there are a lot of externalities that have come to the fore because of COVID-19. So with that, let's get started. And if you look at if you look at the sky, you'll see a very blue sky these days. And if you look at this data, here is pollution in Lahore and Karachi, or Lahore and Faisalabad region and Karachi region in the ongoing month, and also the same time 1 year ago. And if it's pretty obvious, again from looking at the sky or this graph, that pollution has significantly dropped. And so this means that there will be people who will be saved from illnesses and will in all likelihood live longer. There will be less children born with deformities. We know that air pollution has all sorts of problems that it creates. And one of the silver linings of being in lockdown is that we will see less of this. So the big question is, why can't we enjoy clean air during normal times? And of course, the answer is externalities, as we've discussed in the past also. One way to think about this is that there are particular types of markets that are missing in this context. So what do we mean by that? Well, first, one of the problems is that there is incomplete information that does not allow us to enable a market. The incomplete information is, for example, in the fact that it is unknown how much any given individual is polluting and at what time. So if we can't measure their pollution, we can't create policies to abate that pollution, at least directly. The second issue is that there are what are called transactions costs, or the costs of interacting in or engaging in a market. And so this means that even if you can get to know a little bit about who's polluting, there are reasons why, or there are encumbrances or hindrances in your ability to go to them and enter into a contract where they reduce their pollution. And thirdly, property rights aren't defined, so there is no ownership as such of the air around us. And so it's very hard to say you have encroached on my clean air by polluting, because these property rights aren't defined. Again, this is all stuff that we discussed in some detail before the break. But again, we're coming back. So one way to do that is to create a Pigouvian tax. A Pigouvian tax is a tax that is levied on a negative externality, or more specifically, an action that creates a negative externality. As you can see in this graph, the marginal private cost is lower than the marginal social cost. That is, the blue line is lower than the black line, the black upwards shaped line. And so if you have a given marginal revenue of that you can sort of get from this production, compared to a scenario where you are internalizing all social cost, where your output would be at the level equivalent to what is described here as the new output level, you will, because you're not internalizing those costs, your costs will at that level be much lower than your marginal revenue. And the difference between that private cost and the actually much higher social cost is just the cost that is being borne by others. And so as that increases, as you increase the production, you can go much further out before you reach the point where marginal private cost is equivalent to marginal revenue, and you are disincentivized from further production after that. So you then would like a system where if you were able to levy a tax on top of the marginal private cost curve, the blue line, you can see that there is a level of tax, of a level of flat tax that you could put on top of um, your production, such that the marginal private cost plus the tax equals marginal revenue much earlier. Now, this is a theory, and um, the Pigouvian tax is one that is intuitive. You should tax things that are creating harm for others, and so it's quite ubiquitously used. But the problem is that there are there is a gap between what is um, what is theoretically good and how the practice turns out. And so one of the problems is that to enforce the Pigouvian tax well, you have to be able to measure the precise level of what that tax will need to be. So if you don't know that level, if you don't have the full information as it's depicted on this graph, you can imagine a tax level that is lower or higher, and so you might come closer to the new output level, or you might drastically differ from it. And so it's actually possible that the output level that the Pigouvian tax creates is actually less efficient than the output level without a tax. The other thing is that in enforcement, that to enforce this, you have to be able to identify who is creating this externality, and this is why something like a tax on gas or petrol is easier than an emissions tax, because it's much harder to monitor who is emitting how much pollution. So think of a rickshaw that produces a lot of smoke versus like a hybrid car that produces very little emission. Unless you had a monitor on the pipes, or you had a good way to measure that in some other way, that's a much harder thing to do compared to a tax that's levied on every liter of petrol that you buy. Um, the other problem is, so how do you know the right amount to tax, as I've gone over already? The other way to solve this issue is the Coase theorem. And again, we talked briefly about this in class. And so how I'm going to describe this is a restatement of the Coase theorem to sort of to apply to our setting. So if transactions costs, or the costs of um, engaging with the market, are low, these costs will include, for example, finding the right person to engage with, creating enforcement, and so on. As again, we've discussed in detail in class already. If transactions costs are low and property rights are well defined, that is, that we know who owns or has rights over a particular parcel of, for example, air or water or land, efficient solutions are always reached for problems of externalities. That is, by bilateral bargaining between the person who is hurt and the person who is hurting, we're able to get to the correct output level. Now, this is a pretty powerful message, and unfortunately, outside the purview of this class to engage with much more. Um, but keep in mind that the conditions that allow for a market to solve the problem of an externality is that property rights are defined and it is easy to transact. And this isn't always the case. In fact, it's often not the case. The third way to solve the problem of externalities is through rules and regulations. So if you mandate that there's a quota of production of this thing that causes negative externalities to this level, then you found you've engineered or forced the efficient outcome. The problem, of course, is that you can only force out. You probably only want to think of forcing those outcomes when the previous two solutions don't work. And so we do this, for example, in issues of, for example, safety. So safety regulations. Why do safety regulations exist? Because it's actually pretty hard for us to have lay people figure out how much sort of what the drawbacks of certain types of actions are. So, for example, many years ago, the US had and other countries had asbestos construction using asbestos, and it took science many years to figure out that this was causing cancer when it was taken out of that construction site. And so you would require a regulator to have conducted that scientific sort of exercise. And if you were just providing this information, imagine that there was a builder that didn't have this information, then they would not perhaps be able to get, if they were acting, their decision on whether to, for example, produce the next house would be contingent on whether or not they knew the safety information. And rather than try to explain all safety implications to everyone, it might be easier to have a regulator come in and create certain safety standards. Another case where rules and regulations are used are traffic laws. So the reason the traffic laws exist, and we don't try to solve this problem through allowing one of the earlier solutions, that is taxation or the cost theorem, is that it's very sort of hard for us to think of everyone that is impacted by us on the road and everyone who could potentially impact us. And it's unthinkable for us to go and enter into a contract with all of those people, or to try and sue those people, or for the government to tax them in a way that is appropriate. There's just too much information, there's just too much, there are too many contingencies, and so that's impractical. And so we adopt these blanket rules for all. You can't drive above a certain speed, for example, for that reason. So think about what is front and center in everyone's mind these days, COVID-19. And one of the things that we're all doing, obviously, and why you're getting this lecture through this form of delivery rather than in person, is that we're all practicing social distancing. So think about the objective of getting people to be separated. That is, if we were to be together, many of us would create negative externalities for others, that is, by passing on the virus. And then think about why we haven't solved it in the first two ways. We haven't tried to create a tax where people are taxed every time they leave the house. And in particular, the reason perhaps is that we're not taxing them when they leave the house contingent on the fact that they're carrying the virus, because it's just too much information required and it's just very hard to police. Again, people can't enter bilateral bargains or individual bargains with others who might be virus carriers where they're paying them to stay at home, because who's carrying the virus is not really known very well. And what if the people aren't able to reach an agreement? So again, the thing that's been deemed appropriate universally in the case of COVID-19 is that rules and regulations are put in place where a country, for example, or a city goes into lockdown, and they might be tracking your movement, things like this. On the question of externalities, one of the things that an externality does, or a class of externality, is what is known as the tragedy of the commons. So what the tragedy of the commons is the overuse of resource. In this case, this is overfishing. The ecosystem of fish is such that there's a certain rate of reproduction. So if you're fishing more than the ability of the fish to replenish, you are destroying ecosystems. Now, the reason that this overfishing happens is very important to understand. And if you think about all of the types of animals that are going extinct because of exploitation, they tend to be wild animals. They tend to be animals that are not being farmed. So why aren't we, even though we eat more chicken than any other animal, why is it that we're not running out of chicken? Is that they're farmed. So in a farm, I'm only going to sort of extract or sort of use that many chicken that are ready for harvesting, quote unquote, whatever the word is. Because I know that if I use every last animal in my chicken farm, then I won't have enough left to breed and to create the next generation of chicken. And so I'm going to balance my need to earn a profit today versus my need to earn a profit tomorrow. And this allows for enough spacing that chicken is nowhere near extinction. Right? That animal is not near extinction because we are farming it. Whereas these other animals aren't farmed, and so anyone can go and access them. So if I leave some fish in the water today, the ship next door is going to go and get that fish tomorrow. It's not as if my leaving the fish today is going to allow the ecosystem to exist. So if the ecosystem is getting destroyed anyway, why don't I go and um, take the fish? Um, so now one solution to overfishing is the creation of quotas again. Now the nice thing about quotas, especially if they're tradable, just like with sort of other markets, tradable quotas mean that I can, if I've got a quota, but I've got a really rickety old ship, and you've got a fancy new ship that's much more quick and able to get to the right fish because it's got a radar system or whatever, I can sell my quota to you and you can go and fish on my behalf. And we'll find a price where, because you, let's say that I have a quota um, to bring back 10,000 fish. And if it cost me, because my ship would have to be on the waters for longer and would have to hunt for the fish, it would cost me, let's say, $1,000 to get 10,000 fish. And you've got a fancy newer ship that will do the same job for $500. Then just by transferring my permit to you, there is potentially a gain to be had of $500. So think back to our example of bilateral bargains over cars, the example that we did on the blackboard a couple of months ago. Here in this example, what we would be doing now is that there would be, by me selling the permit to you for, let's say, $750, you can now go and get fish that are worth, where your cost of fishing is lower. You can go and incur that cost, but then have the same amount of fish. So let's say that my total profit was going to be, so the revenue that I would have made would be 2,000. It would have been 1,000 for me to fish. So there's a total profit of 1,000. Versus if you do it, then there's a total profit. So the revenue is again 2,000, but the cost is only 500. So there's a total of 1,500. Just by transferring the permit from me to you, same amount of exploitation of the fish, we've got $500 more of profit. And so we would divide that profit up. But the problem with quotas is that they take significant effort to enforce, so there has to be a policing system that measures how many fish are being brought back in. That shouldn't be bribable very much. And so that's the issue with all sorts of property sort of bilateral bargaining situations or quota systems, compared to like a blanket law that says, for example, no fishing or fishing only on Sundays or what have you. So there are many things, of course, that you want to take away, the broad discussion about externalities. But one thing that I want you to take away mirrors something that we've talked about before, and that is that you should not judge the productivity or the usefulness of a firm to society just by looking at how successful it is. You don't just look at their revenue or their profits to measure how good or bad it is. Previously, we talked about this in the context of rent seeking. But now you can think of a firm that creates a lot of negative externalities for others, such as through pollution, and is earning a lot of profits. And that's not an economically wise decision to be making, even if it's earning a lot of profits, even if it's contributing to economic growth as narrowly defined. And so that's something that I want you to take away. Now, we can design markets, and we've talked about the California Clean Air Act before, but let's just do that again. So California moved in 1990 from giving permits to firms to establishing a market in which emissions could be traded. And why did they do this? And so if you look at what hasn't changed, they still decide the aggregate level of pollution to be permitted. So California as a total will pollute X amount this year, because they're balancing against economic needs. But regulators have added on to themselves the burden of policing and monitoring everyone's actual emissions. In this case, they're assuming that emissions are qualitatively the same. They're saying it doesn't matter which chimney in California is emitting the pollution, it all goes into the same shared air around us. This isn't always true. For example, in the case of light pollution, you can think of a case where if there's so much pollution already, a little bit more pollution doesn't really harm the ecosystem around you, doesn't really impact the sleeping patterns of wild animals or whatever else. But or if you have just a little bit of light in a very dark place, again, it might not impact things too much. So there, perhaps you don't want to make pollution that tradable. But in the case of clean air, in the case of air pollution, the advantage is that the system naturally works towards cheaper ways to abate the pollution, because again, just as with the trading of a permit between two fishermen, if I have a lot of pollution going, but it's very hard for me to reduce pollution, might buy your right to pollution from you. And so you might find that it's so instead of a regulation that says both of us have to reduce pollution by 1 unit each, where 1 unit reduction of pollution to me costs $50,000 and to you costs $20,000, we are now allowed a situation where I continue to pollute as much as I was before, but you now reduce pollution by 2 units at a total cost of, let's say, $40,000. So the same 2 units of reduction of pollution has happened, but instead of it costing 50,000 to me and 20,000 to you for a total of 70,000, it's cost only 40,000 to achieve the same objective. Now, why couldn't regulators have created a situation where they were already saying, Ali Hasnain, you keep your pollution as is, and student, you reduce your pollution by 2 units. The reason is that previously there was no incentive to provide information to abate. So before this act came in, the EPA estimated that cleaning 1 ton of sulfur dioxide would cost $750, and the industry estimated $1,500 as the cost. But when permits came in and were traded, people were selling the right to 1 ton of sulfur dioxide. That is, they were committing to clean their pollution by 1 ton of sulfur dioxide for as little as $150. And so what this means is that existing expert estimates of how difficult it was to reduce pollution were grossly overestimated, because people found, once they were incentivized to reduce pollution, found novel ways to reduce pollution. Now, we're reaching the end, and with a word of caution. So if you do the reading for this week, and the lecture has followed the reading quite a bit, you'll find that the California electricity deregulation didn't work quite as well. And perhaps one of the big reasons was that units in electricity aren't homogeneous like air pollution. So if at peak load hours, so the first thing to think about electricity is that it's very hard to store. It's basically impossible to store at scale. So you have to switch the plant on at the time that the market is demanding the electricity. And demands for electricity are obviously higher in some peak hours, like let's say 5 or 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. through 10, 11 p.m. and tapers off either side. So you need to have capacity that lies idle during the day and during night hours, but then really switches on during peaks. Um, so you need to have different prices at different times. In California at the time, they did not allow the consumer to pay different prices at different times, which is another story, and they discuss that in the chapter. But they also didn't have long-term contracts. So I won't go into the depth of this, but just to say that when you're designing markets, it's very important to get into a habit of experimentation. You want to first potentially do the experiment in a virtual market. Then you sort of simulate the conditions. Then you can get into piloting at a smaller scale for a region, for example. And then finally, um, you scale, but then if you run into problems, you iterate. You have to keep in mind that markets are not necessarily like a homogeneous thing where the same rules would work all the time. In that spirit, we're at the end of this quick lecture. Um, with that, I hope everyone is well and keeping safe, and I hope this is going to reach all of you and be helpful